not going to talk about PTSD and depression. I am a clinical psychologist, and that is mostly what I research on, but because it's a symposium on emotions, I thought I would talk about some of our older work, trying to understand why we have emotions. So apologies if you were desperate to hear about trauma. It also didn't seem like a very festive subject. Thank you very much for inviting me, and it's lovely to be in this fantastic building, especially at the 70th anniversary of the discovery of DNA. I've never been here before. It's a real honor. So I'm going to talk about, let's take a step back really. We've heard about some specific aspects of emotion, but I'm going to talk about why we have emotions perhaps more generally, and what their function is in human mentation. So as Wilhelm Wundt identified many years ago, oh dear, what's happened there? Thank you very much. I've not only done my own talk, I've done all of the other talks as well. I know you've just heard all my talk, but I'm going to give it again, slightly more slowly, if that's okay. So as I was saying, as Wundt pointed out, way more than 100 years ago now, an amazing, profound aspect of human mental life is that we're always feeling something. Now, we might not always be aware of those feelings, but if we focus, we can sense that there's an affective backdrop to every moment of our waking and sleeping lives. And sometimes those feelings dominate our conscious awareness in the form of really obvious emotions or moods, but a lot of the time they're a kind of background hum, but they're always there. And as we heard in Edwin's talk, they're not just a psychological phenomenon, but they're a whole bodily, mental, systemic experience involving systems of interoception, proprioception, but also of cognition, an evaluative aspect to these feelings. And sometimes the evaluative aspect is targeted on clear things in the world that we're aware of. We're feeling something about something that we're experiencing. But often it's just a sense of the goodness or badness of our current situation. We can't quite pin down why we might be feeling in a particular way. And this elusive concept of valence, the goodness or badness of how things feel, actually is one of the dimensions which pretty much any of these affective experiences can be placed upon. And the other is how agitated or relaxed or calm we feel at any one time. So at any one time, we're somewhere in this bidimensional space of more or less aroused, and things are more or less good or bad. So it feels like something that's there all the time that somehow signals to us the goodness or badness of our unfolding reality, surely is something that's central to our lives, and something that should be accorded sufficient respect and importance. But actually, historically, emotions have been really the poor relative of psychological research. And they've been relegated to this role of something that's inconvenient, gets in the way, and somehow interferes with calm, rational thinking and decision-making and higher order cognition. So, for example, Plato talked about the sort of calm charioteer of reason, trying to marshal the white and the dark horses, reflecting different facets of emotion that are trying to drive the reason off the road. And in Buddhist psychology, there's the idea of the elephant handler who's trying to control and wrestle this elephant that's also trying to veer things off the optimal path. And then, of course, Freud's, oh no, it's happened again. Hello, we're going to try again. Have you ever given a talk on emotion where you feel you're actually part of an experiment? So back to Freud. And as we know, Freud's idea of the tripartite model of the mind with this superego, which is trying to control the various opposing forces of the ego and the underlying id. But also in popular culture, the original Star Trek series had the famously emotion-free Mr. Spock, who was always very logical, and the very emotional Dr. McCoy, who was always very emotive, and in the middle was Captain Kirk, trying to balance these two forces of advice. And of course the Incredible Hulk, who the mild-mannered Bruce Banner, who was always trying to keep his emotions in bay, because whenever he got emotional, things started to go very badly wrong. So emotion has really been this poor relative of cognition and behavior in the way we think about the mind. But now there's a real, and I think this is pushing against an open door for emotion researchers, but there's a real, So I'm just starting my talk again, my thing again. So I don't run over time. Oh, okay. But now there's a real move towards trying to bring emotions back into the fold and thinking about them as just as an important aspect of human mentation as cognition and behavior might be. And this is an opinion piece paper from a couple of years ago, looking at these three systems at the top, behavioral, cognitive, and affective, and really trying to argue that they need to work hand in hand to achieve the same goals. And it looks at the rise of emotion research across different domains. It never occurred to me till Edwin's talk that if you looked at the rise of banana research, you might get similar looking graphs. But in this case, it's a real sense that there's a real embracing of emotions to try and understand what their critical role might be in how we navigate our day-to-day lives. And the bottom line, really, I think, if you try and distill a lot of the thinking around this, is that emotions originally evolved to regulate what Ross Ashby called essential variables. There's some excerpts from his diaries, which are all on the internet here. And these are variables such as that regulate things such as thirst, hunger, bodily warmth, safety, and so on. And that these have very narrow homeostatic ranges. And if you move outside of those ranges, there's a serious survival risk. So the idea is that affect signals how well we're doing, or if we take a predictive processing view, how well we predict we're doing at keeping those variables within their viable operating ranges. And on that basis, Damasio says that these feelings, affect, emotions, moods, are the very revelation to each individual mind of the status of life. They're a signal of how well you're doing at the business of living. Now, of course, for modern day humans, we're not really, most of the time, preoccupied with the status of these very basic essential variables. But the argument is that all of the other goals we pursue are actually grounded in maximizing the possibility that we keep those variables within viable operating ranges. So we pursue context, we pursue prestige, we pursue status, because all those things get for free a much more likely stability of these essential variables. And of course, Maslow put this very famously in his hierarchy of needs. So obviously these core physiological needs are essential variables at the bottom. And then these more social motivations of status and affiliation. And then a lot of people spend their life pursuing this notion of self-actualization. But the notion is that these things are all hierarchically related. And by optimizing ones higher up the hierarchy, you actually maximize the adaptiveness and fitness of ones right at the bottom of the hierarchy. So that's the kind of idea of how what emotions might be doing and why they might be important. So what are the different ways that they do this? And what I wanted to do in this talk is just talk about a few examples of how emotions might operate within this broad evolutionary framework. So the first, and we've heard a little bit about this in Edwin's talk, is that emotions, mood, affect act as rapid systemic reconfigurations of the entire bodily and mental system in the face of contingencies we encounter in the world. So they do an immediate reset to deal with situations that we come across. And as Edwin pointed out, one of the most researched emotions is that of fear, so I'm going to use that as an example. So here we see what you might be called a fear cascade. So imagine that there's a threat at some time in the future. That's to the left-hand side. You might feel some kind of intermittent anxiety or rumination about it. But as that threat approaches, there's a cascade of affect going from intermittent anxiety to what you might call anticipatory anxiety, then encounter anxiety when you meet the threat, to fear, and then panic. So there's this escalation of emotions as situations become more proximal across time and space. And this notion that emotions really reconfigure the system in different ways to deal with the subtle nature of the contingencies that we're evaluating can be applied to all sorts of different emotions. So it could be applied equally to disgust, as we've just been hearing, as it could be to fear. So to give a more concrete example of this, imagine that you're told you have to come in and spend some time with a tarantula spider. And you have intermittent anxieties, you worry about this in the days before you go in. Then you arrive in the in the laboratory and you see this box and you're told, oh, the tarantula's in that box. So you then start to feel much more anxious. And then the tarantula's got out of the box and it's brought closer, and then it escapes and it starts to chase you around the room, and you have this escalating fear towards terror. So this is the sort of emotions as rapid reconfigurations of the system along this continuum. And we were really interested in, well, what are the brain regions that underpin these different milestones along this cascade? And we realized that much of the work that has been done focuses on the sort of anxiety to mild fear area, for reasons that we've heard about today when Sophie was talking about spontaneous laughter in the scanner. It's quite difficult to get genuine terror when you're in the fMRI scanner. So there's this kind of amygdala-centric model of fear, which is that fear leads to activation of the amygdala, and that's based on showing people pictures or mildly inducing their fear reactions within the scanner. So we wondered, well, maybe we can see what happens when you get beyond the amygdala activation and you get more towards this terror end. And we had predictions that this might be more ancient midbrain regions might start to become more active. So what we wanted to do is, well, what we wanted to really do was bring the tarantula into the scanner and let it loose while people were scanning. But the ethics committee refused to allow us to do that. We had this tarantula in mind, this Brazilian pink salmon tarantula. So what we decided to do instead was convince people that that was what was happening. So we got people to come in and we built this box. It was a very odd conversation where we went to the people in our workshop and said, yeah, we just want this box where we can move a spider closer and closer to someone's foot. So it's got to have, and they just built it. They were very happy. So the idea was that someone lies in the scanner and they believe that this spider, this big tarantula, is moving closer and closer to their foot. So in order to do that, we had to take the box down to Hampshire, where there's this great place where they have loads of these tarantulas. And we did loads of filming of us moving carefully the spider from one box to the other. And then the plan was people would watch via a video link, which we told them was live screen of the tarantula being moved closer and closer to their bare foot. We blocked off the scanner core with a piece of cloth because we obviously didn't want them to look down and see that there wasn't a tarantula there. But we told them we did this because in the pilot study, the tarantula had escaped a few times and we didn't want it to go into the core. And to make it real, you can get anything on the internet. We found this remote controlled tarantula, which looked just like the one we filmed. And we had it in a big glass case in the scanner room and with bits of twigs. And our PhD student colleague, Oriel Feldman-Hall, when the person was brought into the scanner room, we would give her the signal and she would move it and it would start scuttling around and people would be like, oh my God. So anyway, we did this setup. There's a picture of what would it look like in real life. So what we wanted to know was, as the spider got closer to people's foot, well, we could get beyond this amygdala-centric view and start to see these other cascading brain regions kick in. So the first thing was, did people get more afraid? So 6 here was the most frightened I've ever felt in my life. And you can see that people were on average pushing to 5 as the spider got closer and closer to their foot. So they really were feeling extremely afraid. We were worried that they were going to want to get out of the scanner, but actually we had the lowest movement artifacts of any study. People were just rigid and they didn't move at all. So, and then this is just to illustrate some of the results. This is mostly periaqueductal grey activation, midbrain. And you see it's actually almost inhibited for the first sections of the approach box, but once it gets really near the foot, this region suddenly kicks in and becomes more active. So this is an illustration of this cascading set of brain regions which deal with different contingencies and different nuances of those contingencies, how close, how imminent, that goes on in the world. And of course, fear is just one emotion. We have a fantastic emotional toolbox to deal with myriad contingencies that we might encounter. We've heard about some of those today: social joy and laughter, disgust to motivate avoidance, other social emotions like guilt and shame, and of course things like anger and sadness and so on. So we've got this very, very rich emotional toolbox which gives us these different flavors of affect to deal with different things which we might experience in the world. Now, of course, the spider is a very obvious exteroceptive stimulus, but a lot of the time, as I alluded to before, we have feelings of goodness or badness about situations, and we can't really pinpoint what they're about. And in fact, much of the situations we're in are situations of uncertainty. And in fact, it turns out to navigate those situations is very, very complex. And there's an idea that one other key aspect of why we have emotions is that it gives us very subtle signals to allow us to navigate complex situations where just rational thought and logic alone has not got enough information to allow us to make decisions. So social situations would be a really good example of that. Navigating a social situation so that you're aware of all of the motivations and thoughts and feelings of the people around you and how they might subtly be interacting requires, eludes sort of rational thought and logical analysis. There's something else we need to be doing. So the idea is that the emotion system is picking up on, in a sort of pattern matching way, aspects of those situations which reflect regularities in past experience of things that have been good or bad. And it's giving us these subtle signals of goodness or badness, what Damasio has called somatic markers, that allow us to make choices in these complex spaces where rationality alone is insufficient. And this was really brought to the fore by a story you're all familiar with, I'm sure, of Phineas Gage, who was a foreman in a mining company, and he was tamping down some dynamite with this tamping iron, which you can see him holding there, and the dynamite exploded, and the tamping iron went in through his cheek and out the top of his, shot up something like 60 meters into the air, but went straight through his brain. It did an almost perfect lesion of his ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And this is his skull after he died, and this is a reconstruction of where it went through. And Phineas Gage was able to talk about all the rules of complex situations, such as social rules, but he found it virtually impossible to navigate those situations. And the thought is that this part of the prefrontal cortex is critically involved in this subtle signaling based on regularities of past experience. So one task they've used with patients who have the same lesion as Phineas Gage had, and there's a bunch of interesting studies by Damasio's group on these, is this card sorting task. To give an illustration, so if you have a card sorting task like this, so it's very simple, you have 4 decks of cards along the top, A, B, C, D, and actually the game is rigged so that cards, decks A and B are actually beneficial. So if during this task you always choose those decks, you're going to end up winning more money, whereas decks C and D, you're going to end up losing money. And all your job is to do is say, which deck do you want to choose when you're faced with a card like the 3 of clubs? And if once you've chosen your deck, is the deck, when you turn it over, going to be also a black card or a red card? And there's different amounts of money involved. And it's virtually impossible to penetrate these contingencies. So if people do this task, you say, well, how do you think it worked? What were the different contingencies? They say, I have no idea. But interestingly, what they're able to do, and you can see decks A and B on the top and C and D on the bottom. I would use the pointer, but I'm now completely phobic of it, so I'm just going to put it over there. That they actually learn to choose decks A and B and avoid decks C and D, but they're unable to tell you why. So this is this idea that there's some kind of signal developing as you learn regularities, which guides your behavior in a situation that you find cognitively impenetrable. But what's interesting about this is if you ask people, why did you choose those decks more? And they don't even really realize they've done this, but you say, well, look, you've chosen these decks more, why? And some say, well, I just had a feeling that those decks were better than these other decks. And interestingly, some people had that feeling, but they end up choosing worse decks. And some people don't have the feeling at all. They just say, I was just randomly guessing. So this made us wonder, well, how can we unpack this notion of what we call in sort of everyday language, things like gut feeling, intuition, following your heart? What are the different components that make people good or bad at this? So we used this same task, and we asked people to do the task, and we had several hundred participants. And at the same time, we got them to do another task where we got them to intercept on their heartbeat. So how good are you at noticing your own heartbeat and counting your heartbeat? So on the one hand, we got them to do this card sorting task where we measured their bodily reactions, and on the other hand, completely separately, we got an index of how sensitive are you to what's going on in your body. How good are you at reading these signals if they're there at all. And what we found is that lo and behold, people chose DEX A and B more than DEX C and D over the course of the task. And they had these skin conductance spikes in the middle graph to the bad choice DEX. So if they ended up choosing, just before they chose one of those DEX, they actually had a bodily spike saying, this is a bad DEX. And for the good DEX, they had this increased heart rate acceleration. So this is on average. But again, we found these huge individual differences. So on the one hand, we've got clear bodily signals which say these are the good DEX, these are the bad DEX. And in the separate task, we had a real range of scores on people's ability to intercept and read their heartbeat. So we had some people who were just incredibly accurate and some people who literally had no idea what their heartbeat was doing. So the question was, how do these two opposing dimensions interact? So what we've got on this graph is the three lines represent better, worse, or average interoceptive accuracy, how good you are at reading your bodily signal. And the x-axis is how good were your bodily signals when you're doing the card task in telling you what the good DEX are. So if it's more favorable, your bodily signals are giving you a really good readout. And if it's less favorable, they're giving you a readout, but it's pointing you towards the bad DEX. And on the y-axis, we've got how well do you do at the task. So if we just take the black line, the triangles, you can see that you do really, really well on the task. Your intuitive ability is really high. If you're much better at reading your body and your body is telling you which are the good DEX, even though you have no cognitive ability to differentiate these. But in contrast, if you've got really poor interoceptive accuracy, it really doesn't make any difference how much bodily differentiation there is. Your body could be screaming at you, choose DEX A and B, but if you can't notice the signal, it doesn't affect your behavior. And if anything, it seems to be slightly in the other direction. And you notice that if you've got really good interoceptive accuracy, back to the black line, but your bodily differentiation is poor, so you're reading your body, but your body's pointing you in the wrong direction, you actually start behaving in a very disadvantageous way. So this shows that this notion of intuition, these subtle emotion signals, rely not only on the ability to distinguish what's good and bad, to learn your way to navigate through complex situations, but also your ability to notice that signal. And of course, the choices of cards is something that's really obvious and in front of you, but the way people who work in this area think is that we use this same signal to make plans for everything we do in our lives. So in other words, we're borrowing this system when we hypothetically think about what we'll do next week, next year, next month. We run those simulations through our mind and we get these subtle signals which allow us to make choices about things in the future. Otherwise, it's very difficult to see, given that most of these situations are very uncertain, how you would make these decisions at all. So I talked a bit before about Maslow's hierarchy and this notion that some of those higher order motivations might also actually be very much evolved. And two of those are the motivation for affiliation and the motivation for status. I've completely lost track of time, by the way, so someone just could keep an eye on me. Okay. And so in this study, we wanted to look at, are there signals of evolved affiliation, which also are critical to understanding how this emotion system worked. And this really came out of the idea of thinking, well, we feel good things when we know that people we're already affiliated with or our family members do well, but we couldn't really understand why people have such a vested interest in why complete strangers do well or badly. And this came out of thinking about the sort of quiz shows you often see on TV, where you get someone whose only task is to say, is the next card going to be higher or lower than the one you're looking at now? So there's no intellectual interest whatsoever, but we end up having massive viewing figures and feeling very invested in whether complete strangers win money or not. So the way we wanted to look at this was doing videos of two people who are just confederates, where one was a really nice person who you really engaged with and you liked as you watched their video of their values and their views, and another was a person you really didn't identify with who was very socially undesirable. And what we wanted to see is it something about the similarity to ourselves that drives these affective responses when we watch strangers do well or do badly. So we set up these two videos. We got people to rate how they felt about these people and how similar they felt these people were to themselves. And then we did this very simple task that I've just talked about. Is the next card going to be higher or lower? And these people had to guess, and they had to watch these people win or lose on this task whilst they were in the scanner. And we wanted to see, well, what's the underlying neural and affective basis of why affiliative signals might be working in the way that they do. So what we find here is that if we look at the likability score, sure enough, the SD, the socially desirable person, that's Emma at the top, was liked much more and deemed to have much more positive traits than the socially undesirable, but also critically was seen to be much more similar to the participants in the study than the socially undesirable person. And also they found it much more rewarding. So this is the thing that we think obviously drives these game shows. They found it much more rewarding to watch this socially desirable person win on the task. And when you look at the brain activation, not surprisingly, when the socially desirable person wins, you get this strong ventral striatal activation, which is actually in exactly the same regions as when people did the task themselves. But you also get this activation in areas of the brain, ventromedial PFC and the ventral ACC, involved in self-referent processing. So there's this notion that these people who are more like us and more desirable also activate these other brain regions. And when you look at the connectivity using PPI, you find that the connectivity between these reward regions and these self-referent regions is greater the more we think people are similar to us. So we think emotions here are a critical component in how we make affiliative bonds with new people who we don't know and haven't met before. So I'm a bit out of time, so I'm just going to go cut to the end now and miss out that last study. So what I've tried to do today, with a few abortive starts, and I apologize for that, is make a case for why we have emotions. They act as rapid reconfigurations of the system in the face of contingencies, but they also help us with situations of uncertainty, providing subtle signals of positive or negativity based on regularities of the past experience. This helps us navigate all sorts of decisions and is critical to planning for the future. It is also really important in social affiliative contexts, and I didn't get around to talking about, but also in the way we navigate social status situations. So whether or not your festive season involves a big or a small emotional roller coaster, I'd say at least it's better than not feeling anything at all. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a beautiful delivery 3 times, and apologies for the tech issues. We have time for one quick question. Apologies, we're a bit behind. So.
Hi there, thank you for that. That was fascinating. I just want to ask you a question about when you're talking about differences in interoceptive accuracy. So I'm thinking about highly charged situations. So people who are saying the SAS or the police, and they're faced with massively complex and difficult things where good and bad matters, because you might shoot the wrong person or whatever. Do we know sort of whether you can learn to improve that facility, or are there different things that are associated with whether you're better or worse? Because it sort of matters who screened to be in those highly dangerous situations.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there are studies looking at training interoceptive ability, and people do get better at it. But of course, the other part of it is whether the signals you're reading are actually giving you the right push. And I think that's much harder to train, as it like, because it is essentially a training. It's saying there's something about this situation based on your regularities of experience. And of course, that's critical, because if what you're carrying around the whole time is essentially the baggage of all of your experiences from the past, which are giving you these subtle signals, you can see why for things like mental health problems, these signals are critical to how people get stuck in certain situations. So it's a really interesting question about whether, say, the Met Police have good signals or bad signals based on the past. My hunch is that they have a very strange learning environment, and that's actually problematic. So they're seeing signals which they see as dangerous, which the rest of us might not. And you can see how that could go very badly wrong. But I'm just speculating there.
Well, thank you very much. Apologies for tech issues.